A most terrible man to behold. His physique is all twisted and disfigured, as of by some awful accident. He carries a deadly and cruel chainsaw which he wields with devastating violence, seemingly imbuing him with a superhuman speed for a while. His advantage is also his weakness, as the loud noise can give away his position. So I have tried to heighten my sense of sound, honing in on any sound that is not stemming from nature. Benedict Baker's Journal. Welcome, my friends, back to the fog. After a very long break from this wretched land of nightmares, terror, and death, we come back once again to look at the killers and survivors who inhabit this playground of the entity. And today we're taking a look at one of the more famous Dead by Daylight killers, and one that I'll freely admit I have little love for. The Hillbilly. A wild, deranged, and deformed brute, he runs amok on the killing field with his savage chainsaw, promising death to survivors at the ripping and tearing sound of a murderous, shrieking chain. But before he was the Hillbilly, his name was Max Thompson Jr., and Max Thompson Jr. had quite poor upbringings. While there are no tomes or archives as of yet to explain his backstory in more detail, his biography does give us enough to understand what led to his killer nature. From the day he was born, Max Thompson Jr. was a horribly disfigured child, so much so that his parents kept him locked in his room with only a small hole to shove food through for him to eat. This isolation created a hatred in Max. He did not know love or compassion, and all he experienced was loathing. When he finally escaped his prison, he took out all of his anger and pain on the people who should have raised him and instead abused him. The bodies of his parents were never found, so we can't be entirely sure what he did with them, but we do know what he did next. Max had no concept of love or care. He had no social skills with which to associate with others, and there was one thing that he did know: how to instill fear and lash out violently at things he detested. Shut away from the living for so long, he bears a grudge against the living. After killing his parents, he stayed on his family farm, attacking and brutally slaughtering anything he could find and get his hands on. In fact, as the animals ran free, he believed to have used it as sport. He killed and mutilated animals and people who came onto the farm for any reason, relishing in the carnage as his only means of expression. Somehow, he found and learned how to use a chainsaw and put it to grisly effect on the beasts of the farm. Sometime later, the killing just stopped. The slaughter stopped. The monster of Cold Wind Farm just vanished. In time, the farmland would be settled, the land split up and sold off, but no one ever moved back into the farmhouse. No one dared buy the original home of the Thompsons. If you asked why, the answer was never clear, but there was always one common part that was shared: the subtle sound of a chainsaw echoing in the night. The Hillbilly, based only on what I've read in the bio, seems to suffer from social detachment and psychopathic tendencies. He has no sense of social awareness or interaction due to being shut away from society. This might shock you to hear, but children often come into the world selfish and self-centered. We learn through interaction with parents, family members, and friends over time proper social rules, cues, and behavior. Compassion and love are not things inherently ingrained in us. They are things we experience and learn to share. But hate is something we can pick up on very easily. And Max Thompson Jr. was taught nothing but hate, abuse, and cold distancing. As a result, the only thing he understood was abuse. He lashes out angrily because it's all he understands how to do. Babies cry because they don't know how to properly explain what's wrong, so crying is their default reaction. In the same way, Max kills because he has no other knowledge or experience on how to express himself. He was never shown another way. However, Max is clearly a fast learner, as he was able to figure out and understand how to use a chainsaw, implying that he's not completely unintelligent. Or perhaps he was able to look out of his room somehow and see his father using it, learning the technique from him. You'd be surprised how easily children can learn through observation. It's a lot like when you have a dog and you abuse the dog too much. A dog inherently is neither going to be super loving or super hateful, but the more a dog learns to be hated and abused, it will only understand rage and wrathful and lashing out reactions. A dog that is treated well and loved and protected will often learn to be loving and protecting. Unfortunately for the Hillbilly, that's all the information we have on the Hillbilly at present in terms of a biography and what he was like beforehand. If we learn more about him through a tome or some other archive, I'll do another video discussing it, but for now, let's talk about the Hillbilly in game. Hillbilly is one of the most simplistic characters in Dead by Daylight. His toolkit is basic, and his use is pretty much the vanilla standard. If there's one thing he can boast, it is mobility. The Hillbilly's power is his chainsaw. Holding down the power button will rev up the chainsaw, filling an overheat meter. Once the chainsaw is fully revved up, the Hillbilly will break into a sprint that allows him to move at 9 meters a second. He will continue this sprint until he runs into something or hits a survivor. If a survivor is hit by the chainsaw, it will immediately put him into the dying state, allowing the Hillbilly to pick them up. If the chainsaw hits an object in the environment, it will bring the Hillbilly to a dead stop. However, if the chainsaw becomes overheated, it needs a mandatory cooldown period before it can be used again. Now, Hillbilly's strength is in the chase and in map mobility, allowing him to travel the map fast with a chainsaw sprint and apply pressure to survivors. The downside is, well, that's it. He is limited. His power requires him to read where his prey is going to go, because once locked in the sprint, it becomes very hard to turn while sprinting. You're not going to be able to turn on a dime if your prey turns on a right angle. So most survivors know to wait for the right moment and then make that immediate turn to evade you. Therefore, the key is to make an accurate guess as to where the survivor is going to go and aim for that location, calculating the direction you need to sprint to. Not an easy thing to do for some players like me. Another problem with the Hillbilly is he's not subtle at all. You're not going to be sneaking up on anybody with this guy, as he's revving up his chainsaw and it can be heard 60 meters away from his any given location, meaning you hear him before you see him, and that puts you at a disadvantage in most cases if you're playing him, as it alerts survivors to where you are very early. The good news, though, is that there are weapon add-ons that can help reduce the noise of your chainsaw, and some that provide bonuses to increase your lethality and movement capabilities. The Hillbilly's perks are Enduring, Lightborn, and Tinkerer. Now, if you play Killer, you probably know to fear pallets, as a survivor will more than happily smash one on your head if you get too close to one. Enduring reduces the stun duration of a pallet hit, allowing you to get back into the chase that much quicker. So, I do like to run Enduring for that reason, because I constantly get bashed on the head with pallets. Lightborn not only makes you immune from survivor blinding tools like flashlights, flashbangs, firecrackers, and others, but it also lets you see the auras of survivors who try to blind you for a period of time. I personally love this perk because I love survivors who think they can abuse me with a flashlight spam only for me to smack them silly. And believe me, if you've ever played Killer, know that you already know flashlights are ungodly annoying. If you haven't played Killer, yeah, just know that it's hell for us. And finally, Tinkerer, probably the favorite perk of most players when it comes to Hillbilly. When a generator reaches 70% completion, it will create a loud noise to inform you and make you undetectable for a brief period, allowing you to zero in on the generator and stop the progression. I personally don't run all of these, especially not Tinker, but if I do use Tinker, I think it would work a lot better with Hex Ruin or some other perk that can regress or pause generator progression. Tinker is a good one, but it needs other perks to go along with it, because to me, let's say that I'm on one end of the map and the generator is at 70% so it makes the noise, so I decide to sprint over there to see what's going on. By the time I get over there and scare them off and I kick the generator, all they're going to do is just come back to that generator in just a minute and keep it going. So what I would do is pair that up with Hex Ruin or Pop Goes the Weasel or some kind of other generator regressing perk that will help keep them from just finishing it up in a minute. If perhaps it was at 50% completion, that might be a different story. But once it reaches 70%, nah, it's going to be that much easier for them to finish up. But then again, that's just me. Now, obviously, from hearing me talk, it may come as no surprise to any of you that I'm not good at the Hillbilly, so this video isn't going to end with an awesome meme montage of me chasing down survivors and putting them in their place. Perhaps it's because he's so simplistic, but I can't seem to get the hang of him, which is weird because I actually can do well as the Oni, who has a similar attack style, but I'll do his video later. Hillbilly is just not one I excel at. But regardless of my own skill with him, I'm not going to say he's bad because I've seen the damage he can do from others who main him. He's simplistic, but for some people, simple is best. You don't need to worry about complicated powers or the rules that need to set up the power or certain conditions that have to be met before a power can be done. Like, even when you compare the Hillbilly to the Oni can do something similar to what the Hillbilly can do, but he's limited. There have to be prerequisites in place before he can use it. And even then, it can run out over time. So there are clear differences, and Hillbilly is, honestly, though a vanilla killer in most ways, pretty easy to get the hang of, just not for me, and I think that's more of a personal error rather than a game error. Hillbilly, when looking at him straightforward, is nothing short of a monster. A monster crafted and molded by the cruelty of parents and isolation from the rest of the world, but still a monster. He's the exact kind of beast the entity relishes within his realm. An unfeeling creature whose only means of communication is in death. The entity hardly even needed to motivate the poor fool. All he needed was a realm to appear in and targets to be slaughtered, and the violent nature of the beast came out all on its own. A killer bred for just one purpose. And when you hear the revving of the chainsaw, you know what that purpose is. Thank you for this journey with me into the fog, brief as it is, and I can't wait to join you here again. And I'll see you next time.